And then I also encourage people, please use the chat box, ask any and all questions.
The Q&A.
Absolutely, the Q&A. The more you ask, the more interactive, the more value we can bring you. All right, well, let's rock and roll. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Armstrong. I'm the CEO of Keller Williams Vermont, as well as one of the principals in Strong Will Real Estate at KW Vermont and Strong Will Property Management. We're very honored to have you guys here today and team up with Angela Zakowski of the Vermont Apartment Owners Association. I've been a member for 20 plus years, and Angela and her staff have always brought us tremendous value. And so when I started to have COVID related questions, which let's be frank, it's been a very interesting 12 months. Angela was one of the first people that I thought of and reached out to immediately. And if I had any recommendations for you guys besides, asking in all questions today, would be become a member of the Vermont Apartment Owners Association. They not only help and advocate for our industry, for our profession, for our equity, but they also are a great source of everything from leases to notices. Angela's also happy to tell me when I shouldn't do something I want to do, and I'm always grateful for that. So with that being said, again, please use the Q&A for any and all questions. Angela, what's going on with COVID and evictions, landlords, everything rental law?
I know. I feel like I'm going to be the bearer of probably a bunch of bad news and not very uplifting news for folks today. And also I bring it with the caveat that, again, we are in one of these timeframes where we are seeing the information change very rapidly. So the information I'm sharing today is accurate as of right now. I could shut down the Zoom and we could be done with this, and I could find that some of the information has changed. So my overall recommendation is, if you have questions or you're considering starting an action or doing something, please reach out to us. Please ask the question again to make sure something hasn't changed sort of in the meantime. I think for the most part, the biggest changes we're seeing are coming related to money and the funding that's available for rental assistance. The eviction restrictions and those requirements have been pretty stable for quite some time. So I'm going to start there with the Vermont Eviction Moratorium. So I did get a lot of calls in December, at the end of December, and I'll talk a little bit more about the federal CDC moratorium that's also in effect. But really the one that we're concerned about here in Vermont is this Vermont moratorium. It's really the one that's going to control the landlord-tenant relationship. And so one of the things that is still allowed under the moratorium is you can still send termination notices. So you still have the right to do that for pretty much any reason. There is some exceptions, and the one that I would say call to talk through is if you're sending a notice for non-payment of rent, because there may be some federal requirements, there may be some rental housing stabilization program requirements if you participated in that program. But for breach of lease and no cause, you can still send those notices.
If I may, Angela, I hope you don't mind if I ask some questions as they go along.
Jump in.
One of the questions I have is, if we have somebody who's either not paying or violation of the lease, is it going to be like the deli line when this is all cleared? Like, all right, Mr. Armstrong filed in February, Cole, you were in March, Angela, you were in, April, or are they not even doing the deli line type approach?
We haven't even received that information from the court yet. That is going to be part of the challenge here, is that I don't believe the judiciary has even started to look at this issue and how they're going to prioritize cases. Generally, the courts handle cases on sort of a time basis. So the older the case, the more the court puts pressure on to move that case forward. And I would anticipate we'll see some sort of similar approach once the moratorium lifts. But I would expect, once we know that the governor's not renewing the state of emergency and the moratorium is going to lift, that the court at that time will start advertising a plan. I would say they are currently working on a plan. It just hasn't been made public or been shared. But I know the judiciary has been looking at all these things. They still have to figure out how they're going to handle jury trials, because that hasn't been sorted out either at this point. So there's, a lot of work that's still being done.
Thank you.
So under the moratorium, you can actually still file your eviction with the court. And one of the reasons why this requirement is in our moratorium is our termination notices are only good for 60 days. So it wouldn't do any good if people could send termination notices, but then couldn't file with the court to preserve that notice. So that's why that requirement is allowed, or that's allowed under our moratorium. But then what happens is immediately the court says it's stopped, there's no further action. You can't actually even have the tenant served with the court paperwork. So there's no way to even notify them that the case has been filed with the court unless the landlord happens to relay it to the tenant. So it just sort of hits and stops. But your notice is preserved and you're sort of in line waiting for the courts to open. When is the stay going to end? I don't know. That's the $1 million question. The way it's currently structured is that the stay extends for 30 days after the end of the state of emergency for no cause cases and for non-payment of rent cases. So that ties it to the governor's declaration. He's been extending by 30-day increments in the middle of the month. So the one that we're currently under ends in the middle of February, so Monday. I fully anticipate we're going to see him extend it for another 30 days. And so, these dates are going to just continue to be pushed out until one of two things happens. Either the governor ends the declaration of state of emergency, or the legislature decides to unhitch the moratorium from the emergency declaration. I'd say that second one is not very likely based on everything I've seen, but the legislature does have the authority to do that. So I think, Brian, getting back to your question about prioritization, the other thing we're going to see is that in the moratorium, any cases that were for breach of lease but didn't rise to the level of one of the exemptions are going to be allowed to proceed immediately upon the termination of the state of emergency. So for that group of cases, they're going to get jump started ahead of rent cases and no cause cases. So there's going to be some prioritization just with the way the moratorium is written and when the restrictions end. So under the current status of things, that moratorium would end on February 15th. Please don't, call me on the 16th and say, the moratorium ended, my breach of lease case is going to go forward. I'm going to be shocked if the governor doesn't extend for another 30 days. So I'm just that little caveat. There are written into the moratorium 4 exceptions. So there are 4 types of cases that the court will allow to go forward if you can prove and provide evidence. And I will say, having handled sort of a handful of these, we're talking very extreme behavior of all of them. So it's not just sort of a run of the mill. I saw a couple of pot plants inside their unit. It's got to be a significant problem that falls into any of these 4 categories. So illegal activity, illegal drug activity, acts of violence, or other circumstances that seriously threaten the health and safety of other residents. So those are sort of the 4 categories of cases that the courts are allowing to proceed with, but you have to petition, provide evidence, and say this is why we fall into one of these categories in order to be able to do that. And they are. I've had some, and I've had tenants removed under these provisions, but they, again, were for very serious behavior issues and circumstances. So what are some of the issues that we're running into with the moratorium? The big one is, when will it end? And the answer is, I don't know. I've explained sort of how it's functioning. And I think there's just too many things that we don't know about how long we're going to be in this pandemic and how long we're going to be dealing with sort of restrictions in lots of avenues of our life. I will say one thing is I think we need a few more exemptions to the ones that are listed there. And so one of the things that we're working on, or I've been working on and trying to get in front of the legislature, is some categories of sort of constant issues that I've been hearing from landlords that are creating a big impact. So one is the landlord needs to occupy that rental unit. We've had that come up a number of times. Landlord circumstances have changed, or it was a short-term rental for a year while the landlord was off doing something else, and now they need to move back for work or for other things, and they don't fall into one of those exemptions. So that's one that we've requested that the legislature take a look at. One is damage to the property. So damage to the property or damage to the unit doesn't actually cleanly fall into one of those other exemptions. Under certain circumstances, it might hit that, health and safety, serious health and safety issues of other residents, depending on what's going on, but just pure damage isn't really covered. So you could have a tenant in there completely destroying their unit, and we don't fall into one of these exemptions to move a case forward. Usually there may be other stuff going on that would qualify, but just purely the damage issue won't. Sale of building. We've been running into this a lot, and this kind of ties into a lot of these single family homes that are currently rented where, folks want to relocate here or move within the Vermont community. And the biggest market for, say, like a single family home is an owner occupied. And if it's currently rented, that restricts it and keeps it from being sold. So that's one that we're asking to open up. I think out of the three right here, that's probably the one that may get the least amount of traction with the legislature, but it's one that we've asked for. Another one is a tenant has the ability to pay rent and is refusing to pay rent. With the prior rental housing stabilization program, there was no way this exemption would fly because that program was pretty expansive. You didn't have to prove income. Like, there was a lot of things that it was a pretty easy application process and a lot of money. The new money coming into Vermont has income requirements and income guidelines. So somebody who's working and not paying rent isn't going to qualify for that program. If their income's above a certain level. So if the landlord's not getting rent, it's because the tenant is just refusing to not pay. And so to make that landlord carry that cost until the moratorium lifts does not seem fair and is not, I think, within the spirit of the moratorium. So that's another ask that we have had in terms of opening up the moratorium for that category of people. How can you help with these? This is always the million-dollar question. Yeah. This is something that your state representative and your state senator needs to hear from you about. Specifically, unhitching the moratorium from the state of emergency or adding more exemptions. So I've given you the 4 that we're asking for. There's very likely that there's other ones. These are the ones I've heard over and over and over again, but your representatives and your senators need to hear from you that these are issues and that they should consider adding these exemptions to the moratorium. So that's how you can help with this situation. I've gotten a lot of questions about why aren't we fighting to just have the moratorium completely removed and completely done away with. Vermont is not going to go that way. There have been some new reports and new research coming out about actually that have specifically been looking at our moratorium and how it has contributed to the low rates of COVID and the low death rate that we have in this state. The legislature is not going to remove this moratorium. The best that we can do is to try to get as many exemptions as possible right now to move cases forward that need to get moved forward.
Angela, really quickly, we do have a couple of questions, and folks, please keep bringing questions. Would you prefer, to answer these, Angela, towards the end after we go through the information that you have, or would you prefer that I, share them as I see them on the screen?
It may depend on if they are. Why don't you just to ask me the questions. And if it's something I'm going to cover in a little bit, I'll let you know, and then we could revisit it. And if it's not something I'm going to cover, I'll deal with it right now. So
excellent.
Sure.
So folks, please keep asking them. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So from Ashley Baduno, and hopefully I pronounced your last name correctly. So I'm in a situation where I leased with tenants at the early stages of COVID and had to do it remotely. Some are absolutely terrible and have trashed my property, enough that even my contractors do not want to go into the apartment due to how dirty they are. I enlisted a property manager mid-year, and our goal was to just wait out the lease and get new tenants in there. Now they are overstaying their lease, probably another great thing for an exception, in lease, and know they have Vermont law on their side. Can I start requesting health inspections to document the state of the apartments to help with the evictions? Thank you.
Yep. And I would say, yes, you can absolutely request those health inspections to start documenting the situation. And it may get to the point where there could be some impact to the health and safety of other residents. As you start to collect that documentation and find out more about what's happening and get more information about the condition of the unit, you may be able to actually get yourself into a category that would allow the case to be pursued forward. So getting that additional information, I think, would be very helpful. And if it doesn't, even if it doesn't allow you to pursue under the moratorium, I think it will be helpful long term, because it also shows you're trying to be attentive to the problem, you're trying to deal with the situation, and being proactive in that regard.
And a quick follow-up question. We have another one from Jean-Paul Gagnon. Is Ashley asked a follow-up question? I'm going to guess the answer is going to be no, especially if she puts this right out there in the future. Or excuse me, right out when she makes the request. Will that be seen as retaliatory? I've never seen as retaliatory when I tell the health inspectors right up front, hey, just to let you know, there is some issues that we're having with the tenants. So I just want you to be up front so that they know it's not retaliatory, that it's more just dotting I's and crossing T's.
Right. You have the right to call in the health inspector. It's not retaliatory against the tenant to call in the health inspector. So the retaliation statute says that the landlord can't take action against the tenant for the tenant calling in a health inspector. But landlord calling it in because they have a problem at the property, no. And in many cases, it makes sense for the landlords to use the inspectors to help them to build that case, to document, to be a third party to document. So no, I wouldn't worry about retaliation.
Personally found when you've been right up front with state or town officials, so they don't think somebody's trying to slant them one way or the other, they welcome that. And I've even called in the fire department before on hoarders, and that's been invaluable because they'll issue the citation. So it's not so much Brian saying you've got to clean up your living room. It's the fire department saying you've got an issue here.
And I mean, for most of these inspectors, this is not their first rodeo. They completely understand the dynamics in the landlord-tenant relationship and what's going on a lot of times. I will say many of them do appreciate a quick heads up, like, look, we're not on good terms with each other, where there are some issues here. I wouldn't get into too much of the details, right? You don't want to sort of taint it from that side, but it's definitely okay to just say, look, relations are strained, and I need some help so I can assess the condition and what's going on inside.
I'm going to use that, relations are strained. I like that, diplomatic.
Yeah.
So from Jean-Paul Gagnon, I hear some other landlords talking about COVID funds available for upgrading units. What can you share with our group today?
I will share that I'm hopeful that there are more funds going to be made available. So Vermont received in 2020 $1.25 billion of CARES relief money, and some of that was used for economic grants for businesses. Some of it was used for the rental back rent program, and a part of it was used for a program for landlords to be able to rehab units. And so it was an up to a $30,000 grant per unit with a 10% landlord match. So it's basically $33,000 for $3,000 of your own out of pocket. to do things to basically get units to a habitable state if they had habitability and code violations. Were some requirements with that program. For a number of years, you have to rent at the Vermont State Housing Authority, median rent rate for your area. You would need to give more priority to sort of the homeless population that's looking for housing and some of the low-income folks that are looking for housing. But it was a very successful program. It oversold, meaning they had more applications into the program than they had money for. And the state right now is trying to find a way to revive that program. I know as a part of the governor's budget proposal, he put in requests for more money for that program. So sort of independent of any of the federal relief money that's coming in. So I know the state is really looking at continuing that program and trying to get it up and running again. If we get more flexible money into the state from sort of the next round of relief from the federal government, I think that's definitely one of the programs that will get funded again. It was very successful, and I believe 200-ish new units around the state were put online and upgraded and were made habitable with those funds. So keep an eye on that. And, that's one of the things that we'd be making announcements on the Landlords Association website. So.
Excellent. We've got one more question in, folks. If any others roll in, I'll probably suggest that we, get through a little more of the presentation, but please keep rolling them in because we want this to be as interactive as possible and bring as much value to you as possible. So from Maria Nanahan, are blocked exits and hoarding enough to pursue one of the current exemptions for the moratorium? I've had 3 inspections, and these, along with others, have been documented repeatedly, called out by the health inspector and fire inspector. And that certainly is a significant health concern.
I would say potentially. I mean, I think in that situation, it's probably worth trying. I mean, one of the challenges that we are having with asking to go forward is sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. And I don't always have sort of a clear line as to where it is. If it's a multifamily, I would say absolutely. If it's a single family home, it may not, because it's sort of contained to that particular set of tenants. Anything that we see that's going to potentially spill out and be a health risk or an issue for other people in the building, I think it's worth pushing, because at least if you push it and the answer is no, you have that documented that you tried if there's a problem at that property. Right? I think we're all a little sensitive over the fire that happened in Burlington, and wanting to be mindful and protective of the building as a whole. So.
And Dorgan and Alicia, we'll get to your questions just a little bit. And Mariah, thank you very much for the correct pronunciation of your name. I hope I did not offend you. Thank you for joining us today.
So there is also a federal eviction moratorium. It was one that was issued by the CDC. And I bring it up because I think it's important for people to be aware of it and to understand maybe how it interfaces with the Vermont moratorium. So this one only applies to non-payment of rent situations. And it only applies upon a tenant certification that they're covered under the moratorium. So this one requires the tenant take some proactive action to notify you that they are covered under this moratorium. It's not a blanket one like the Vermont one. This is the one that was going to expire at the end of December, and then it got pushed out to the end of January, and now it's been pushed out to the end of March. So it is still in effect, and it's still something to be aware of. Where we get some tension and where we see some be aware of it, because you may need to follow it. It does say that states that have eviction moratoriums that are at least as restrictive as the federal one don't have to follow the CDC one. But it does also say that if a tenant is covered under the federal CDC moratorium, the landlord cannot take any action Whereas the Vermont moratorium still allows you to send a termination notice, still allows you to file a case with the court. And so there could be an argument that if a tenant is covered and has provided you with the appropriate paperwork, that the CDC moratorium applies, that you cannot even send them a termination notice, even though the Vermont one says you can. So that's why I'm just saying, be aware of it. If you see one of these certifications, talk through with an attorney or somebody before you send out a non-payment notice. This is more for just raising your awareness and making you aware that this is out there. And this is the one that I've heard rumors as a part of the new federal 1.9 trillion plan that they're working on very well could be extended to September 30th, 2021. So these are some of the dates that we're seeing thrown around for how long we could potentially expect to see some of these restrictions in place.
You know, I'll just add, and this may be a little bit of a best practice, but Stronghold Property Management, we sent out early on notices to all our tenants, like, and I know you're going to talk about the potential rental assistance going forward, even though there's not a lot of information, but we sent out notices to all our residents saying, you know, hey, if you're having trouble, please let us know. Please talk to us. Here's some information, here's some information where you can get assistance. Please talk to us. And a couple things that allowed us to do is people actually did talk with us. And so we could see early on, when we're going to have an issues, whether it's a building owned by the principals of the firm or by our many clients, and get into a proactive relationship. And so I would just encourage anybody to really be forward thinking in their communication, and certainly give into any temptations to tell somebody exactly what you think, how you think it, in the sense that I know one landlord, not one of our clients, nice guy, but very tell it like it is in their face. And he's had up to 30% of his 55 units not pay. Whereas out of our 100, I think we only had 3 or 4. We got most of them to bi-weekly payments. And we bought one tenant out who moved up to the mother. So I can't stress enough to anybody listening. Right. Forward-thinking, diplomatic conversation will go a long, long ways.
Right. And I think it's incredibly challenging right now because we don't know what people's circumstances are. And a lot of folks have had changed circumstances, and they may not always be wanting to share that with you, their financial struggles or their financial position. And yes, they may still be working. And so you see them leave and go to a job, but maybe they're not working 40 hours now. Maybe they're working 20. Or maybe they're working less, or, so I think, being a little empathetic to folks' situation. And yes, I know as a landlord, you deal sometimes with people who have horrible reactions to you, are incredibly rude, disrespectful, like not treating you like a very good human being. And you know what? There are folks that are taking advantage of this. Absolutely. But I think it's difficult sometimes to jump to conclusions about people's situations, particularly right now. And so, that communication and just trying to work with folks and be open and communicative with them, I think will serve sort of in the long run. It's not perfect, but it can take you a long ways.
So would you prefer to skip ahead a little bit and then answer more questions, or you prefer to keep rolling with the questions right now? What's best for you?
Let's do this RHSP update real quick, and then we can do some more questions.
Excellent. Thank you, folks.
Pretty quick. So RHSP, that was the 2020 Rental Housing Stabilization Program. If you had submitted an application in December, prior to the deadline of December 11th, but you have not yet received payment under that, those applications are still being processed by Vermont State Housing Authority. They're being processed in anticipation of receiving some additional funding. They needed more funding to cover all of the applications that came in towards the close of the program. They have asked for $2.8 million to cover the rest of the applications. The legislature is in the process of approving that allocation. It's just working a little slow on its way through the legislature. But that is what is holding up, and that is where those applications are. So if you submitted a complete application, you haven't gotten money, it's not because you're not it's not that you're not necessarily not going to get money, and that was a lot of double and triple negatives. It is still likely you could see those funds. It's hopefully coming. If you want to find out where your application is in that, you can reach out to my organization. The ones that they have processed, we can tell you if you're on the sheet for payment, assuming this money comes in. So yeah. And if you're not there, it doesn't mean you're not going to get money if it comes in. It's just that your application hasn't been processed yet. So feel free to reach out to check in. We do have the ability to look and see where you are on that list. So you want to shoot a couple questions here?
Absolutely. So folks, keep them flowing. Thank you very much for your questions. All right, from Alicia Sharp. I have lost 2 sales contracts because tenant refused to move, not paying, but working on a month-to-month lease. I have a mortgage. Attorney gave notice on sale, but she does not move.
Yep. And that is one of those categories that we are asking the legislature to add to the exemptions to the moratorium. And that is the reason why, is that sales have fallen through. The tenant is not moving, and there is no other way to force them out the door right now. So that is one of those situations I would say, please reach out to your representative and to your senators and ask them to add sale of building, sale of unit to the list of moratorium exemptions.
Excellent. And Ashley, I would encourage you, if you have a talented real estate agent, feel free to have them give me a call. I may have some ideas for you on that one. And certainly if you don't have a talented real estate agent, please reach out to myself or Cole Elwood directly. I've got a couple ideas for you that might be very, very interesting and extremely helpful. we've avoided a lot of evictions in the past just with some of our tactics, all legitimate, all respectful, for the record, to help people come to that realization or get the seller to the closing table with a tenant remaining in. And I'd be happy to discuss that with you or your agent. Very talented individual, Melanie Saya. Will they owe back rent after the moratorium ends?
Yes, they will. So Vermont was very clear in its moratorium that the tenant's obligation to pay rent and their obligation for the rent continues. So yes.
Excellent. And another one from Ashley. What if they are Section 8 tenants who have their whole rent covered and they are just refusing to leave? They have not provided paperwork to certify anything. This was simply me trying to remove them after their lease was up. Yeah. They contacted Vermont VT Law, and I was told to stop telling them they need to vacate the property.
I mean, you can keep telling them they need to vacate the property. Your ability to enforce that statement is currently off the table. So even if the lease is up, and the reason for that is every process to enforce a tenant leaving is an eviction in Vermont. Mm-hmm. And so there's this moratorium on all actions for eviction. So even if the lease is expired, if the tenant's not moving, the way to force them out is an eviction. And those have been paused for right now. So that's why you're in that situation. Can you still continue to send them non-renewal, no-cause notices and tell them they need to leave? Absolutely. Can you continue to tell them they need to vacate? Absolutely. Can you enforce that statement right now? No.
I've always found letting people know that I very politely and diplomatically will be part of their life until they either pay or get out. And I assure them that we follow all state and federal laws. And I find just a common drip. And I think I may have missed one from Dorgan Keeney, my apologies. My tenant is living in an apartment attached to my severely demented mother. She had moved in with the understanding that she would take care of my mother in return for some rent. She turned out to be an alcoholic, has proven to be dangerous and not able to care for my mother. My mother has deteriorated in the 1.5 years since she has lived in the apartment, has not paid rent since March. Would it be a health and safety issue that I need to have someone living up there to help care for my mother? Thank you, Dorgan, for the question. My heart goes out to you and your mom.
Absolutely. And I would say potentially, and I think that's another one where it may be worth pushing that with the court, push it onto the court to make that decision to tell you, no, this isn't serious enough. That one very well could fall within that fourth exemption.
And before I answer another question, one tactic, which is the last thing that anybody wants to contemplate doing, is buyout agreements. And I will tell you, we've done them periodically. They make me want to throw up every time I give somebody money for what I shouldn't have to do it. But at the same time, I've often been able to negotiate for half a month's rent. And even though it's a disgusting idea, it's a lot quicker and a lot cheaper than court. And so I'd encourage you to talk with Angela or your attorney about any such agreements, because there's ways to make them more effective than not. And I would not give them a check until they're out. Never underestimate it. As revolting as the idea is, or repulsive as the idea is, to consider a buyout.
Right. Well, and sometimes from a purely business and monetary perspective, it makes sense. It makes financial sense. So there's that piece as well. But it's not for everybody, and not everybody wants to use it. And I'm with you, Brian. I think it has a time and a place, but it still makes me every time we do one. So
Oh, go ahead, please.
Let's do the new rental relief program real quick. So Vermont has received $200 million that's specifically allocated for rental and utility assistance. So it's been earmarked for these purposes, and within the confines of sort of a very federally prescriptive program. So these are not the flexible funds that we had with the RHSP program. And as things stand currently, Vermont's got to figure out how to spend $200 million in rental assistance by the end of this year. So for a little state, we're going to see. First, we need the legislature to allocate money so we can start spending it. Because right now, the clock is ticking. So I can give you some tentative program details of things to expect and why I'm saying it's going to look a lot different from the RHSP. Some of this hasn't been fully developed yet, but is based on what was in the federal law that was passed with this money. I know Vermont is looking to earmark $110 million of that $200 million for rental assistance. Vermont's also looking to earmark at least $16 million for utility assistance. So that's the amounts that looks like we're gonna be have available for these two big programs. Like the RHSP, back rent payments can be included, though only back to March of 2020. Mm-hmm. So the RHSP covered all back rent. There were landlords that got like 2 years worth of rent arrearage in that program, because we made that other program super flexible. So not going to be able to go prior to March of last year. This new program is going to require tenant means testing, which means the tenant is going to have to provide proof of income, and they're going to have to be at 80% adjusted median income or below to qualify for the program. And so one of the details that hasn't quite been worked out is which AMI amount is going to be used. There's varying numbers. There's a Vermont number, there's a Chittenden County number, there's a county by county number. And so one of the things that's still trying to be sorted out is, can we have different numbers for different parts of the state? Do we have to have one number? Can it be the Chittenden County number for the whole state? Because this is going to impact who's going to qualify for these funds. There will be either a look back to 2020 income or the month just prior income. So there will be two different ways for the tenant to certify, and depending on what their financial situation is, they may want to do one over the other. So it has built in some flexibility for being able to adjust if someone's income has changed recently. unlike the RHSP, which required a delinquency, this program will pay prospective rent. So the tenant doesn't actually have to be behind to be able to qualify. So if their income meets the requirements, they can apply in. This program will also pay in 3-month increments. So if the tenant is approved, it can be for a 3-month period, and then there's a reapplication at the end of that 3 months. So instead of having to reapply every month, it sort of extends that period a little bit. You can reapply into the program, and the tenant can qualify for up to 12 months of rental assistance going forward. So again, it would be done in that 12-month or the 3-month increments, but they can qualify for up to 12 months. So they could have this whole year paid for if they get in and their income doesn't change. And unlike RHSP, because the tenant's income is being looked at, there's not going to be an upper cap to the rental amount. So whatever your rent amount is, if the tenant qualifies based on their income, that whole amount will get paid. It does look like for this program, it is going to be an online only application. There's not going to be a paper component. And depending on which, there are companies that are developing these platforms for this that will have potentially call centers, so people can call in directly, give their information over the phone, have it put into an application process, but there will not be a paper application that you can print off or have mailed to you. It's either going to be done over the phone, or you're going to have to, or the tenant's going to have to do it into the online platform, which is creating some challenges for those of us in Vermont with access and being able to access this system. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you may not get all of your arrearage. So even if the tenant owes, from March 2020 going forward, you may not get all of that money back to March. You may only get a portion of it and then money going forward. So it's going to look very different than the RHSP. Okay, we have some more questions.
So from Glenn Moyer, Glenn, great to see you on today. When a lease terminates, is there an issue having the tenant leave at that termination date? My guess is, Angela, if they refuse to go,
there's nothing wrong with sending that notice and telling the tenant that they need to vacate at the end of the lease. Your ability to enforce that notice currently does not exist beyond filing that notice with the court in an eviction. So your ability to force them out the door is off the table, but you can still give them that notice. And in many cases, the tenant is going and finding a new housing. But if they don't, you're limited in your tools to deal with the situation.
Would you recommend, and then we'll answer some more questions, but I'm going to throw this on there. Would you recommend that if we're signing new leases and we have even a smidge of concern of tenant A leaving so tenant B can move in, that we put a provision in tenant B's list or lease subject to tenant A vacating, all parties recognize, more eviction moratoriums exist?
Well, and you should have that language in your lease, even COVID issues aside. And if you're using the Landlords Association lease, it has that in there. It's called the delivery of possession clause. And so it makes that lease contingent upon your ability to turn possession over to the tenant, because we do, even without COVID, run into this situation where tenant A doesn't leave, and now what do you do? And if you have to do an eviction, that's going to take some time. So your leases should have that regardless.
Another great reason to be a member.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got from Randy Lindholm. Will this PowerPoint be available after this?
I can make it available, absolutely. And this presentation is also being recorded and will be available to rewatch on the Vermont Landlords Association YouTube channel. So you'll be able to get it both places, and I can certainly post this out in the public resources section of the Vermont Landlords Association website, where there's a ton of COVID related issues, and also as I get new updates for these various programs and when they launch and things of that nature, you can find it out there as well. So it's a good resource for folks.
Excellent. Coming from Susan Belleville, I have tenants on SSDI who can pay rent, but they are fully aware of the moratorium and are refusing to pay. I have not received rent for January and February on 14 of my 17 tenants. My heart goes out to you, Susan. Any information about the income issue under consideration for rent payment from the state? P.S. I pay utilities for these people as well.
Yeah, I think my guess is your tenants will probably qualify for the new program because it's tied to the percentage of income based related to AMI, so adjusted median income. And most folks who are on SSI or SSDI are going to fall well below that 80% AMI income point. So their portion, they may still be able to qualify for assistance under the new program. If they don't qualify, we will hopefully get some sort of exemption to the moratorium that says if you have the ability to pay and you can't pay, we still get to proceed with evicting you because there's no good reason for you not to be paying your rent. The other thing I will say is that if they've experienced some sort of financial impact or other stress because they are on a fixed income, they may be able to talk to their housing authority representative and see if they can get their income qualifications and recertifications redone to adjust what their portion is that they're paying. Because if they've had other impacts or other issues related to COVID or just in general, they can have that income recertified to change what they are paying or what their portion is for rent. So
excellent. Good one from Richard Kirshner. I had full reimbursement for 6 months unpaid rent in 2020. Do I need to send a tenant a notice each month that the rent has been unpaid just to document that it's due? By email, regular mail, certified mail? Tenant has not signed for certified mail in the past. Will I need to document when I do apply for any new program for rent reimbursement?
You will not need to document that you have been sending notices and the tenant has been ignoring you. I think it's perfectly fine to keep sending those notices. If they're not picking up the certified, maybe don't pay the extra money for it. Send it first class mail, send it via email. If you got to the point where you were going to file a court action, then I would say that notice maybe needs to get delivered a little differently so it's confirmed that the tenant received that notice. But if you're just sending them that reminder every month, email and first class mail is fine. And would sort of build the pack like, look, we've been trying to collect. This new program is going to be more focused on what the tenant situation is and what the tenant household situation is than what the landlord has done. So it's going to be less about have you tried to communicate with the tenant and more about does the tenant meet these income requirements and is rent owed, or does the tenant need assistance going forward?
Excellent. We've got another one from Ashley Maduno. If you do buy out in rent and the rent repayment program comes back, can you recover the amount that was never paid if the tenant has already vacated the property?
Not under this $200 million that's coming in. This is has very specific federal parameters. Some of the programs that were being run under the RHSP, which, as you were alluding to, was the Group 2B, which is was the vacancy loss payment, where they would pay half of the rent owed if the tenant left. Or money to move, which was money for tenants to have first, last, and security at a new place. Those are not programs that we're going to be able to continue to run under this new $200 million. Is it possible that more money is coming in under the sort of the Biden proposal and the proposal before Congress? More flexible money would be coming into the state. And so there is a chance that with more flexible money coming in, that some of these other programs that were being run in 2020 would get revived and restarted. But under the 200 million, no. It's for tenant households and tenants occupying the place. It's less, the distinction, I think, to make is the RHSP money was a tenant rental assistance program, and it was also a landlord economic assistance program. So it was both of those. And that's why we had so many different ways to apply and for landlords to get access to the money. The $200 million that's coming in is a federally prescribed tenant rental assistance program. So it is very focused on the tenant and the tenant household, and is not, would not be considered a landlord economic assistance program.
I'll add this question. I want to make sure we get to Renee's and a couple more. If somebody was in the process of buying a building and they inherited a tenant who hasn't been paying, is there any way to basically adjoin the rights of the prior owner to the current, to the proposed new owner?
Yeah, I mean, that's paperwork. You should talk to your real estate attorney about making sure that you have the appropriate assignment of rents, assignment of lease, and assignment of debts. So those can get assigned over to you as a part of the real estate transaction.
I think this next question may have been answered, but I want to make sure we answer this for Randy Lindholm. Are there any tentative details for tenants who are not going to apply, as in people who were under Group 2 under the RHSP?
Not that I've seen. And again, we're having to work within this federally prescribed regulatory scheme, and there's not a mechanism that's been allowed yet for the landlord to apply without tenant participation. So because it requires tenant income information, the tenant has to participate in the process. So I think, and that is the reason why I have included has the ability to pay rent and has failed to do so in that list of exemptions that I'm asking the legislature for, because I would view tenant not participating in this process as tenant has the ability to pay and has failed to do so. Part of the Group 2B was landlords wanting to get money and preserve their eviction rights for current pending eviction. This program has not made a decision yet on how they're going to handle those situations. Are they going to require a landlord to stop an eviction? Those details have not been worked out yet. I mean, I can tell you where I fall, which is I think you should be able to take the money and just be subject to the moratorium. And that's, that's it. You shouldn't have to choose at this point between, do I keep these unruly tenants if the moratorium lifts and having rent, because you can't get rid of them if they're not paying the rent. So that's a battle that's going to happen as the program gets more fully developed. But the landlords aren't going to be able to apply on their own and get partial money. So
the next question is, do the tenants do the submission or the landlord?
So it's set up to where the tenant does a submission, or the landlord can submit on behalf of the tenant with the tenant's permission. So the landlord can still submit, but you are going to have that income information and income documentation. So it is going to require participation by the tenant at some level for providing information. So these are, some of that ability and how easy it is going to be for a third party to submit on someone else's behalf is going to be determined by which platform Vermont State Housing Authority uses to process these applications. Some of them are going to have lots of access and lots of ability for people to be able to assist, and others not so much. So some of that is we're waiting for the allocation to happen, so all these systems can get put into place so we know what we're talking about and what we're going to deal with. But it is going to be challenging in some of these situations. I know landlords struggled. They would go knock on the door with the RHSP paperwork, trying to get signatures, and couldn't get the tenant to open the door, which is part of the reason why we had that Group 2. We knew that was going to happen. We cannot make those adjustments under this federal program. we're stuck. We're stuck with what the Fed said that we could do, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and it's all the more reason as tempting it is to tell people what really to think, just to be super diplomatic, because it's not easy.
Yeah.
Danielle Butler, have there been any indications yet about what the income requirements will be for this new program?
80% AMI or below. So
Excellent.
80% adjusted median income. What has not been set yet is which version and which AMI number. So there's a Vermont AMI number, there's a number by county in Vermont, there's a number that's carved out for Burlington and that metropolitan area specifically because rents are higher and incomes tend to be higher in that area. And so it hasn't been determined whether it's going to go county by county. I can tell you we want to use the Burlington AMI and we'd kind of like to use it for the entire state because that's going to cover way more people than otherwise. But we may very well be looking at a county by county AMI number. So it'll change depending on where you live.
Another great point. From Igor Polinoff, a client verbally told a tenant that he is going to sell a home. Tenant sent him a letter saying, I'm not going anywhere. There's a moratorium. Is this considered sufficient proof of notification for when the moratorium ends and things go back to normal?
No, because for any sort of eviction process in Vermont, you have to have an official termination notice and then a court action to enforce that notice. So, and that termination notice has to be in writing. It has to be delivered to the tenant, either hand delivered or through the mail or by the sheriff. So a verbal notification would not support an eviction case for the tenant not moving, but you could certainly put the paperwork in place to make that happen when the moratorium lifts. But it would go to the tenant then not being able to say, well, I didn't know, nobody told me, this is a surprise, right? You did receive notification, we talked about it, we told you this was going to happen. So that's where that would come into play.
We've got a great question from Ashley Meduno, and then I've got a question for you too about Burlington's ordinance change.
Yeah.
Ashley, can I draft a petition to send to the state senators and send it to your office for collecting signatures? I know individuals who can write to their senators, but if we come collectively with a multitude of signatures, it may make more of an impact to change the few items you mentioned earlier in the moratorium.
What has the most impact for Vermont representatives and senators is having their inbox flooded with individual emails and individual phone calls from persons. It's very easy for them to ignore a petition, and it does not have the same impact as the 50 people on the petition sending individual emails to those representatives and senators. So they get those individualized responses from people and communications from people has a way bigger impact than somebody just signing their name onto a petition.
Excellent. So the question I have, and I really appreciate everybody. We may go over a couple minutes if you can stay on it. Angela, you can't, then obviously we got to wrap things up.
I'm fine.
But one of the concerns that I have right now, and it's raised more concern than I've ever had before, is the Burlington ordinance change. And just to give people a backdrop, where my concern lies, I'm not only an apartment owner in Burlington, I think it's a great community for the most part, challenged by the town occasionally, but my concern is if this passes, while they have been clear, there's no official, got to be rent control, not rent control. We can assume with high likelihood it probably will be. But then I also see it potentially being a domino effect, going to Winooski, going to Barre, going to other towns. So what's going on with the ordinance change, and what can we do to help Burlington apartment owners who are a valuable member of the community provide a better impact to slow it down?
Sure. So where things stand right now is on March 2nd, I think that's town meeting day. Burlington voters are being asked to vote on a charter change for Burlington, and the charter change would allow Burlington to adopt an ordinance saying landlords could only evict for cause tenants in Burlington. So You wouldn't be able to send a no cause notice to your tenant. You wouldn't be able to send a lease non-renewal to your tenant. You would be required to provide the actual reason for the termination, and then would have to support that reason in court. If the tenant didn't vacate, the ordinance charter change as drafted also mentions that the city could set reasonable rent increases to ensure that landlords were not using the rent increase provision as an end run around the just cause requirements, which is basically a hidden rent control requirement. So where it's at right now is the voters in Burlington will vote on that on town meeting day. If they vote it down, and it stops until the city council takes it up again, which given the current makeup of the city council, I fully anticipate if it got voted down, they just would try again. Assuming it passes on town meeting day, it then is sent to the legislature for approval. So there will be a big fight at the legislature over this. And there is, I think, some ability to get traction there. Vermont has a statewide eviction process, and Burlington is asking for a carve out to that process. The state is also currently working on sort of housing policies that are more state driven. That are looking at things like creating a statewide rental registry, a statewide inspection program, basically pulling from the local community into a state system. So for them to be taking those steps that we're going to do this statewide and we have this statewide program, but then to be like, oh, Burlington, you can go do this thing that totally blows that up, I think is a very valid argument and a very valid point for the legislature. I actually am not sure how well received this would be at the legislature. I think there will be a number of representatives and senators who have a very serious problem with this. So there is a question about whether it would even be approved by the legislature. Then assuming if it gets approved by the legislature, then it's back to Burlington for the development of the ordinance itself, which is sort of a whole nother round of like fights and arguing over what the actual language should be. So this is a very long process.
Absolutely, and I applaud Angela for all her help, protecting and promoting our rights as landlords to be responsible members of the community. National Association of Realtors, I'm on the board of directors for the state of Vermont, has also put forward, I think, give or take 30,000 to help fight it. So any other questions from anybody today before we thank you profusely for your time? And I'm going to just
run through this. I'm just going to post this information up on the screen. So these are just some helpful reminders for things. If you receive notification that somebody in your building has a positive test, you may not ever hear. The Department of Health is not notifying property owners. The person who tests positive may let you know. You don't need to disclose that to the rest of the building. And I wouldn't unless the person who tells you gives you permission to notify others that it's there. But just, if you get that notification, make sure you're doing your common area cleanings, or if you're not, that you have somebody that starts doing those. And it's always a good time to remind your tenants about staying home, wearing masks, following social distancing guidelines. And then one sort of little quirky area that came up is if the tenant tests positive and has pets or assistance animals, you may need to have another conversation with them about how they're going to manage that situation. Because when they're quarantining at home under those circumstances, you don't want them traipsing in and out constantly of those common areas. The few situations where this seems to have come up, the tenant had some direct access to the outside. And so the landlord was able to say, you need to use that door to take your dog out. You cannot be coming through the other way and through the hallways. So that, there's some other planning and implications that may need to be discussed with a tenant if that comes up. And I will say, if you're looking for contact information, I put our information up here, but I also put an email up here if you're interested in specifically the Burlington Just Cause issue. So I think that's supposed to be BVT landlord. I think I typed that incorrectly.
That'd be something I'd do.
bvtlandlords@gmail.com is the place to get signed up on the notification list. So as things are happening, that's the system that's keeping people in the loop. Let me go check real quick just to confirm, because I think I typoed that email address, and that is very embarrassing.
While you're doing that, Angela, please, everybody, if you have any additional questions, I'd also like to let you guys know that Strong Will Property Management and Strong Will Real Estate are doing a investor landlord series just about how to buy, what to buy. So check us out on our website, allburlingtonhomes.com. And one question I'd love to ask before we part ways, and I let Angela finish the correct email.
I didn't typo it. That's actually correct. btvlandlords@gmail.com. That's correct.
What could Angela bring us? What could Strong Will Property Management, Strong Will Real Estate bring you guys on these sessions? Because we'd like to do these at least for the next few months. What could we bring you that would provide value to you? I think, lead paint's always forgotten by a lot of landlords, but what other information could we bring our audience to bring value to you guys? And feel free to ask questions as well.
And while folks are thinking about that, I did get a couple of email questions that came in. So I will deal with them right here. So I had a question that at which point with the eviction moratorium not ending, could the landlord choose to take somebody to small claims court over just the money part? And I would say that's totally also a possibility. You could choose to just pursue the money and the money payment against your tenant. So small claims court is up to $5,000. So that's sort of the cutoff that you'd be looking at for whether or not that would make sense. But you certainly would be within your right to take the tenant to sue them in small claims court for just the money piece. It's not the eviction. It's not going to get possession back, but you could get a judgment order that they owed you that money and then pursue all of the various collection methods. If somebody's working and you know that they're working and just not paying you, that could be one avenue for dealing with the money piece of it. And small claims court cases are still happening. So
yeah, that's actually, I didn't even think of that. Whoever proposed that or brought that up, that's a great angle because it just keeps and we all know it. We work very hard to be responsible members of the community. 89% of the residents we work with are fantastic. 11% make us appreciate the other 89. Yeah. But two comments from Ashley, Lead Safe program and about the Vermont efficiency program. So some topics for next time. Okay. And Mariah, getting your name correctly, buyout negotiation examples. And I can't stress enough, guys, please, feel free to contact Angela afterwards. I've got Ashley's name in front of me, or myself, or a member of the Strong Will Property Management, Strong Will Real Estate. And if you guys are having issues with your tenants and you need to sell your buildings, I will let you know that we've got active people who are looking to get into it, and we've got people who pay cash or buy without tenants moving out. And then Ashley, thank you very much for all your interaction today. Rockingham has a $5,000 grant for multifamily renovations that is super easy to get approved. Really appreciate you sharing that, Ashley.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, yes, really there are some various programs in some of the local communities. They get CBGD block grants. And so there's a ton of different programs. Also the 5 home ownership centers around Vermont have different programs for energy efficiency or for some rehab. So there's so many different places to find resources and money. I had one more email question that came in that was, are there any provisions for landlords to come into the state of Vermont without quarantining if they need to come in and deal with a tenant situation? And under all of the guidance that I reviewed, I think the answer is no. So it's not considered sort of an essential work situation. And that really covers people who live in Vermont leaving and what happens when they come back. If you're coming into the state, you're required to either quarantine in place where you are, which means quarantining for 14 days prior to coming into Vermont, or 7 days with a negative test. And then if you come into Vermont, you're fine. There are some travel restrictions, though. It depends on how you're getting here. whether that works or whether you have to quarantine again in place in Vermont once you get here. There are some exemptions for purchasing a property, but they're pretty specific. And, the main one is if you have a signed purchase and sale agreement, you can come to that property for something and then leave without having to quarantine, but you already have to have a signed purchase and sale. So it's, Vermont's still pretty locked down with those out of state restrictions right now.
And that's a great point too. The other thing is some people, and I'm not an attorney with ACCD, have been able to declare, it might be if you own your property in an LLC, declare themselves as an essential employee, but double check that before you do that. I was amazed to see, I knew of a couple of businesses that did have people to travel under that thing, and they were told they didn't have to quarantine for business, which really surprised me.
Yeah.
But I can't stress enough, first and foremost, thank you to everyone who joined us today. Like I said, we're going to be doing these on a monthly series for the foreseeable future, just to keep bringing you guys information, update. Please reach out to Angela. I encourage you guys to join the Apartment Owners Association. It's been invaluable for Strong Will Property Management and Strong Will Real Estate. And while I'm not an attorney, the individual had some buyout questions. First, feel free to reach out to me, although I will tell you just to double check what I say to Angela. I probably have done 10 or 12 of them in the last 15 years. And they have all been successful except one, which was actually successful because they left before we brought in the check and never wanted the check.
I mean, that sounds like a win to me, but
it really was actually, because it really was. But I can't stress enough, Angela, thank you so much for sharing your time. I know it's valuable, and the association's time, and to everybody who joined us today. And it sounds like, again, you'll have this presentation on the YouTube channel or the recording.
Yep.
We'll post it. And folks, send us emails afterwards, or check Strong Will and Property Management Real Estate out on our website, allburlingtonhomes.com, so we can keep bringing you guys better information to run better businesses and be better members of the community.
Yep. Well, thank you, Brian, for the opportunity. It's been fun.
It's going to be interesting for a few more months, and it's going to get back to normal. It's going to be so boring.
I know. What are we going to talk about? We'll talk about the weather again.
And the last comment I'll say, remember, if this is the apocalypse, I expect a nuclear war and zombies, so this isn't half bad. Thank you, folks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Great job. And I think we're good. Excellent.